Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're doing it in person, and I'm joined by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, who's a professor at Tehran University and also a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. And, the reason I really want to speak with you today is the Trump's new enduring peace plan, 20-point plan to bring peace to Gaza. What would you make of this deal in terms of what it contains and the likelihood of it actually being accepted by Palestinians? Because from what I've heard, Netanyahu immediately approved it, which perhaps should give us reasons for concern.
Well, I read parts of it because, I'm pretty busy here. Actually, I should be asking you questions. This is the first time that we're together, so I should be, you're more knowledgeable than I, so I should be asking questions. But I think it's clear that it's a form of capitulation. It's from what I read, it's very one-sided. And then we saw the Netanyahu interview in Hebrew afterwards, where he basically said we're not leaving Gaza. I don't think Hamas is going to accept. I think that this is just going to be an excuse to blame the resistance and the Palestinians for further bloodshed, but it's not working. The world has changed. Public opinion in the United States has shifted dramatically. We see the new polls that have come out. Republicans, Democrats, Israeli support, it's just bleeding, is hemorrhaging heavily and very swiftly. And I think the longer this war lasts, the worse it gets. And I don't think it's something that can be repaired. I think it's permanent. So I would imagine that Hamas probably may not reject it, but they may say certain changes have to be made, and the Israeli regime and the Americans will accept.
One of the issues which really stood out was the board of peace, which has to be established. So someone to govern the Palestinians, one as opposed to themselves.
Who could be the best person on this planet to do that?
Well, for me, I almost saw this putting, Tony Blair.
Cheney could be worse.
How to make sense of this? I mean, of not just the Palestinians, but the hundreds of thousands of Arab lives he must have on his conscience. Now he's supposed to govern over the Palestinians. I mean, this is, it almost seems as they put this in just to make sure that the Palestinians can't accept it.
And I think, I know you know that he doesn't care about the Palestinians or the Iraqi lives or any lives that he's destroyed. And I think the United States is completely detached from reality. And we saw that when they launched the war against Iran. Their understanding was that Iran would collapse. That just shows that contrary to what we often think or we're told or we are conditioned to think, that their intelligence is fantastic and they have a good understanding of the world, I don't think that's the case. When the Israeli regime attacked, I think you and I may have discussed this before, it was clear from the very beginning to me that even during those early hours when he took major losses, they struck apartment blocks and killed generals and academics and scientists, and there was no retaliation yet. For me, it was clear as day. For many others, no one was worried about the future. But they thought that Iran was about to fall, and they had made plans and they had serious discussions. But their understanding is warped by the so-called experts that tell them what they need to hear. And I think the same is true about our whole region. Glenn, in Morocco, there were huge demonstrations a couple of days ago for the Palestinians, but it's more than about Palestine. And it's the grievances against the regime in Morocco are enormous. What is happening is that this whole situation at Gaza is building up rage across the region. And you know that these regimes are all in the American cast, from Qatar to Morocco, from Turkey to Saudi Arabia. They're all in the American camp. People are increasingly frustrated. So the Americans are pushing this in a very dangerous direction. I don't think the Israelis care, or at least Netanyahu, but the Americans should care because they are. This could become very explosive. When the Arab Spring happened, no one, or very few people, thought that the Arab world collapse in the way the regimes would collapse the way they did. Today, the situation is far more expensive, and the problems are far greater. So it's their own miscalculation. They are misreading the situation simply by putting in, especially this administration, the Trump regime, putting forward a name like theirs, because if there's one name that you would not have, that would be Tony Blair, after what he did to Iraq.
This goes Bush or Blair. Just those two names, they should keep us. But I often make the point that it doesn't even seem like this is named just Israel, because, as you said, they're losing friends and allies in Europe and even in the United States. This opposition group, their adversaries are now more enraged. They're taking more bolder steps to check the Israelis, and all the governments which are trying to ignore the complaints of their own population, as mentioned, from Turkey to Egypt. It's more and more difficult for them to keep friendly relations with Israel. So and it's hard for me to see why this would even be in their interest to drag this on. But it makes me wonder, why did the Israelis jump on this so quickly? And probably they had a role in developing the proposal with the Americans. But what do you think is the attraction to them? Do you think it's merely assuming that the Palestinians will reject it, so they can, a bit like Zelensky does, he says, we want an unconditional ceasefire because the Russians can't accept it. Let's have a meeting between only Zelensky and Putin before anything has been agreed upon, which no one will accept. So then they can say, well, we want to appease, the Russians obviously don't. Is it narrative control, or is because its objective is to fire it, or is technically cleanse Gaza, or this will be irritated over needs?
I think it's a combination. I think part of it is reading, wishful thinking, but also I think that to a large degree, they do recognize that the chances for this being accepted are very low. Right before we began the conversation, I saw that apparently Netanyahu had imposed some modifications. So from the very start, it was clear that it was a capitulation agreement, and then after his modifications, it's going to be even worse. So I don't think it's going to get anywhere. The very fact that Trump has threatened Hamas again, I think, shows that there's a lot of skepticism about them accepting. But he's done that before. He's been threatening Hamas on numerous occasions, to threaten to wipe them out, and genocidal talk coming from the White House is not new. But I don't see this as really doing a good. The Israeli propaganda, Glenn, doesn't work. They used to be the best. I mean, for me, they've always been sinister, but they know how to play the game. But they seem to. It's not just losing a touch. They seem to be. I don't know. I think I show you that short clip of those two, the influencers. I mean, it couldn't be worse. That the African American and the lady, see, when I saw it at first, I thought it was like they were ridiculing the Israeli regime and Zionists. So things have changed, and getting back to what you said earlier, Netanyahu's interests are not the interests of the Israeli regime. Netanyahu is pursuing his own interests, and his coalition partners are fanatics. So they don't count. So I don't think the regime understands the damage that this is doing to Israel, and probably Netanyahu does. He's smarter than the rest his coalition partners. But I think Netanyahu is basically fighting for his own survival, political survival, and his own freedom because of the war. And if there's an opportunity to ease the conflict, then his coalition could fall apart and he couldn't go to jail. So I don't think he really cares about the regime. He cares about staying in power, keeping the conflict going, and but he's destroying Israel.
Well, it's always dangerous when states put themselves in this situation where it's all or nothing. That is, and Israel kind of done this now. They see the possibility here. They can knock out Iran, wipe out Gaza, and they can create the greater Israel. On the other hand, if they fail, it's, they bet everything on this, and it could go very poorly. Now, whenever countries are in this all or nothing situation, they often do radical things. They'd be willing to take huge risks, which they otherwise wouldn't. So it's hard to see the Gaza thing in isolation. Did you see another attack on Iran come?
Yes, I think that I think it's almost, well, you can't say anything for certain, but I'm pretty sure that there will be an attack. And some say it's pretty close, some say it's going to be further down the road. An attack on Iran, if it doesn't happen sooner, from my understanding, it'll become more difficult during the next couple of months because it will be autumn, and that sort of weather is not good for aircraft or military operations carried out by an air force. So I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I do think it's almost inevitable at some point. But I think it's going to end badly for the Israelis, just like I was confident that it would end badly first time around. I mean, when we look at the Western media and Western elites, the Israelis, they say that they've won on all fronts and that they're in command. But where are they in command? They haven't been able to take Gaza after 2 years. It's October the 7th is days away. They were supposed to finish this in weeks, but it's been 2 years. They've slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. They've pushed people until the survivors into a corner, but they haven't been able to say that we've taken Gaza. They've destroyed their image. They're hated across the world. I think that's probably the biggest reason why I call all of this a defeat for Israel, the regime. They haven't defeated Yemen by any means. No, neither the Americans nor the Israelis. They haven't beaten Iran. They haven't beat Hezbollah. And I think that people are increasingly appreciating Hezbollah because now they're seeing how the United States, its allies in Lebanon, the prime minister, the president, all under foreign pressure, the Saudis, Turkey, Qatar, the Americans, NATO, they're all putting pressure for them to force Hezbollah to give up its weapons. So it just shows that Hezbollah is not like Hamas. Hezbollah is surrounded by NATO. I'm surrounded by enemies of the resistance and enemies of the Palestinian people, in fact, but they still stand their ground. I think people in the past really didn't know how difficult it was for Hezbollah to fight. They felt like Hezbollah controlled Lebanon. That was never the case. They have more than half of the population on their side from different religious and ethnic groups and sects, but they never controlled the government, and the government has always been hostile. But Hezbollah is steadfast. So the Israelis have not gotten rid of Hezbollah. The only place where they've succeeded is Syria. But when Syria first fell, I may have said this on the show, I said that was a tactical victory for the Israeli regime. Not at all. But I think it was a strategic failure. And I still believe that. Ashera has predicted he was going to tilt to the American camp. We saw him in Petraeus. That was extraordinarily embarrassing. It was embarrassing for me to watch. I felt like it was it was unwatchable. But I think it exposed the reality of Syria. And for me, the most important thing in our region and beyond is for people to wake up to reality. So the Israeli regime is now disbanded. And what has gone on in Lebanon, the conspiracies against the resistance, they've now been exposed. Those who don't want to believe that the Dirty War in Syria was a CIA project from day one, they're intentionally closing their eyes because it's just so clear. We see how Ashara and Orjolani and his foreign minister, Shaybani, they've been meeting Zionists and they've been meeting, the worst of the worst, and people we need Palestinians despise. And I think Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has been vindicated. Unless someone knows, keep their eyes closed, everyone by now knows what's going on. And that enhances the status of the resistance. Because for a very long time, the West, the Qataris, the Turks, the Saudis, all these countries in Western Asia, they were demonizing the resistance for many years. Qatar had a special vote, and Turkey. But now I think people are seeing through all that. So Yemen today, they're seen as heroes in their hard role. Hamas is seen as resilient. Hezbollah is seen as vindicated, and it also has made huge sacrifices. So while there's been a heavy price to pay, but I think the fact that people are waking up to the reality of what's going on in West Asia, that is the most important thing for change. Without people being increasingly aware about the real facts on the ground, the reality on the ground, without that, you can never have a solution. And I think this is the beginning of the path to some sort of solution for the region.
No, the loss of the narrative for me it seems very important here because political propaganda, it exploits weakness in human nature. That is, we always tend to, as we organize in groups, we tend to think of the in-group and out-group. As long as you can identify us as good and the opponent as bad, nothing really matters anymore. You can invade, then at least you bring your freedom. So facts kind of disappear into the background. This is the main idea. So in Europe, everything is being recast as liberal democracy versus authoritarian. And indeed, with it, we can do nothing wrong. And the opponents are always in the wrong. But in the Middle East, the war on terror always had just a lovely framework because it was a new, as Bush would say, we represent civilization and they are they're the terrorists. So again, it's a nice, good and evil approach. I think where it went off the rail is, all the opponents in the Middle East are terrorists. So the Yemen, Iran, Hezbollah, they're all terrorists. But now, when you have, as you say, the former head of the CIA having this bromance with Al-Shara or Jolani, again, with former Al-Qaeda leader, maybe sitting there, we used to be on the different sides, but, no, not really. But yes, but anyways, they're cooperation now. And then on the other side, they see the people of Gaza being massacred, genocide. They're seeing Hezbollah fighting, Yemen also standing up as they're under attack. The whole narrative seems to shift. It's not so easy to have this civilized people versus the barbarian story anymore.
And it's also a multi-layered narrative, because while the West was portraying it in the political establishment as good versus evil, in our region, the same was being done by this very powerful media that was basically funded by oil and gas wealth. During the 7-year-long genocide war that the Saudis and the Emiratis carried out against Yemen, and they had the support of the collective West, and they had the support of Turkey and Qatar and everyone as they were carrying out the genocide. And the entire Arabic media was hostile towards Yemen. And a lot of ordinary people did not like al-Sarrallah because they were influenced by the narrative. But then then Qatar and Turkey split away because of the siege and all that. But what changed was when it was Yemen that stood up for Palestine. Suddenly, all those narratives that had been created for years, just they were just destroyed. And now Yemen is seen as heroic. Or again, going back to Lebanon, the Qataris, the Erdogan, Saudis, and others, they tried. Saudi Arabia has moved a bit away from Wahhabism and Salafism, unlike Qatar, because Qatar's official religion is Wahhabism. But Saudis under Mohammed bin Salman have shifted away from the somewhat. But in any case, they have tried to depict Hezbollah as the enemy of the enemy, and they're and to portray them as secular. But Hezbollah, from the very beginning, they were fighting to prevent Syria from falling into the hands of the Americans. That narrative has also collapsed because people are across the world are seeing Syria for what it really is now. Friends of people who you and I know, they have their position. Syria has shifted. So people are waking up. Hamas used to be a tool for hammering the Palestinian people. Even now in the West, they use it, Israel. But people increasingly are seeing Hamas in a different light because people are saying, because people are waking up to reality. It's sort of like during the 1960s in the United States, people supported the Vietnam War. And then gradually when the body bags began to come in increasingly and people started reading about Vietnam, and he saw that the story of Vietnam was not exactly what they'd been told. And the anti-war movement as it began to grow, increasingly people were understanding that, no, this Vietnam is not the Vietnam that, they're telling us that we have to go there and we have to fight and that they're communists and that they're the enemy. And I think that's what's happening in our region as well. People are seeing both the resistance in a different light, and they're seeing the Israeli regime in a different light. And so neither the Arabic media is having its impact, the oil and gas funded media, nor is Western media having the impact that it had before. And I would argue then that these regimes are increasingly putting our friends at risk. Because if just one of them gets into trouble, then I think all bets off.
Yeah, I'm not good to say about the failure to hold on to the narrative, because when it came to Syria, our main argument was, I was always making the point that, where's the evidence that Assad has these chemical weapons? Because he always appears to use them just as, he's winning. Yeah, this is the time when he invites foreign intervention. But, all that makes me an Assadist, and I'm denying that there's chemical weapons. But of course, once the Syrian government collapsed and he left for Moscow, Assad, what happened to, there was no chemical weapons? And no journalist asks about this. So what happened? I thought I was a conspiracy theorist for arguing that he did not have a huge stacks of chemical weapons left. But then the city people do kind of put two and two together and realize, maybe what our governments and media tells us during wars isn't always correct.
Exactly. And the irony, of course, is that the West gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons. They gave him the military intelligence to use it. They gave him the political cover to use it. And he used it extensive, killing many Iranians and many Iraqis. The city of Halaj, I was there soon after the attack. Some numbers say 6,500 people died that day in Halaj in one attack. When I got there, all the bodies got buried, but I remember going to this empty town. It's a bigger city now. But the point is that the West gave them those weapons, and now they're complaining about Syria. But in Iraq, where they had the weapons, they destroyed the weapons after the first war. We all knew there were no weapons. I was in the anti-war demonstration in London before the attack on Iraq. We knew there were no weapons. I was as an Iranian the Iranians were against the war. They were protesting the war. They said it's illegitimate. I was a victim of chemical weapons, and I was on the streets of London saying, no, there are no chemical weapons. Don't lie. In Syria, they never used chemical weapons. And in Iraq, they were using it day and night. In Syria, they never used chemical weapons. They fabricated the story. Once he left, the story just disappeared. Okay, well, now that he's gone, tell us where they were. Apparently, he put them in a suitcase on
On the plane to Moscow.
on the plane to Moscow.
But I find it fascinating when they can't, when there's no good narrative left, the solution is, let's not talk about it. It's the Nord Stream solution. Once they found out it's either Americans or Ukrainians, then let's just stop talking about it, because there's no more good stories to hear. So it's fascinating.
Nothing good would come of it. and also the prison, where the whole Caesar law against Syria, which starved the country and destroyed Syria, and it's still being used to starve Syria. The Americans, they haven't removed the law. So back then it was because of all these prisons. Well, where is the prison? Where is that? I'm going to say Syria was some utopia, or they didn't kill people. It wasn't at the end of the day, it was a Ba'athist regime. As an Iranian, then but you can never be a fan of Baathism because we fought Saddam Hussein. Syria was very different from Iraq, and it was not nearly as brutal. But obviously, the Syrian government was better than ISIS. Obviously, the Syrian government was preferable to Al Qaeda, and but they lied about all these things, about these prisoners and chemical weapons, basically to overthrow Syria, as to make Syria what it is today. The objective from day one was to Balkanize Syria, and that's what they're doing. Everything that's happening now, Seyed Hassan Nasrallah predicted, and he said it many times. And people are going over his speeches and uploading them online. Of course, a lot of it get deleted or they get shadow banned. But everything that he said turned out to be correct.
This is the standard recipe in any nice propaganda, though, is if you oppose the bombing of Iraq, then you're taking the side of Saddam Hussein. If you oppose the destruction of Libya, you're taking the side of Gaddafi. You oppose the destruction of Syria, then you're a Salvist. I mean, there's no middle ground apparently.
Glenn, I was shot in the war. I was shot in Mara by Iraqi forces. I survived 2 chemical gigs. I have a shrapnel wound. And I was at every single anti-war protest that I could participate in the Iraq War. Yes, if I had to choose between protesting against the war against Saddam Hussein, I would do that, because the West has no more legitimacy to do it. They are worse than Saddam Hussein, these regimes, because they're the ones who created Saddam Hussein. And then when they don't like you anymore, they turn against it. But they're the ones who created it. They're the ones who did the chemical weapons. So yes, I would protest, and I would protest against Libya, and I would protest against Syria. But yes, they use this propaganda in order to deceive the ordinary people or naive people, or people who have some sectarian hatred or religious hatred or some racial hatred. That's how they divide and rule. And they did that in Syria too. Let me give you the example of Iran. As soon as the Israelis carried out that unprovoked war against Iran, you saw the narrative on Iran. They began to build up an anti-Iranian narrative in the West. It's always been anti-Iranian, but you saw CNN. Someone sent me a clip where on CNN they were talking about sleeper cells in the United States. So the Iranians had sleeper cells. This is CNN, who hate Trump. So what were they doing? They are trying to prepare the ground so that ordinary Americans would not protest against the war. And then I was on, what's his name, Piers Morgan's show. The last time I was on this show, it was very nasty. And he wouldn't let me talk, and my connection was not good either, because of they extoled the internet in Iran for security reasons. But he read this like a list of evil things that Iran does, how evil, they beat women, they do this, they do that. He'd never been to Iran. I'd invited him and he refused. But you've been to Iran. It's a fantastic place. It's a wonderful country. But in any case, people like Piers Morgan were building the case to legitimize Papua New Guinea. That's what the Western media does. So they start bashing Iran because they are sort of like the artillery. They're the media artillery. They're pounding the enemy position to legitimize the attack. That's what they did at Syria. That's what they in Gaza. The whole hoax, the lies about rapes and child beheadings. They knew they were lies. I mean, after 3 or 4 days, you'd know. Maybe during like the first 48 hours, people would be full. But after 2-3 days, people would say, well, okay, where are the bodies? Where are the children? Where are the dead women whose breasts were cut off or whatever? You remember all that. They didn't exist. But they kept saying it for months. And even now, Trump still says it. And Piers Morgan, when I was on his show, he was still saying it months later. Why? Because they prepare the ground for war. They prepare the ground for genocide, for mass murder. That's how it works. And that's what they did in Libya. I'm no fan of Gaddafi, but remember the claims that were made that he was going to, what was it? What are those pills that they give for, to rape when Viagra, so yeah, Viagra and all that. Okay, what happened? They just use the propaganda. Once it's over, we saw he died, and they move on. And then 20 years later, what they do, 30 years later, they come out with the truth. In the history books, they come out and say, well, that was way back then. And then, they create this, reinforce this facade of openness and so on, rest. But when it's happening, you don't hear any of this.
Well, you mentioned divide and rule. It kind of takes me to my last question, because what Israel has typically done quite successfully is they had, you isolate one country in the region and you go after them. The United States, to a large extent, does the same, which is why a key criticism is that now they're going after Iran, China, Russia, all at the same time, that this is part of the recipe for disaster, that usually you try to calm the others, explain that, we're the best of friends and we just have to knock out this one guy. But with going after Iran now as well, it seems to spread. And I noticed that you had commented on it as well, that the Chabahar port in Iran, which is built for financed by India, is now also coming under sanctions. I mean, this is a key strategic project for India, though, to connect, not just with Iran, but with Central Asia, Russia. How do you read this? So, what is the significance of going after the Indian financed Iranian port?
I think the United States again they're out of touch with reality. What they've done it's not just this, it's the visas alongside Chabahar, and of course it's the tariffs on oil. As we've been speaking with our Indian colleagues here, I just spoke to an Indian colleague an hour or two ago about the situation, and he said the mood in India has changed dramatically towards the United States. Now, we don't know what's going to happen down the road because everything is so unstable. But although this is not necessarily a happy news, that this is being sanctioned, but I think the more the United States isolates itself, it's a good thing for the rest of the world. So their aggressive posture towards India, towards Brazil, is, I think, in the long run, beneficial to Iraq, to Russia, to China, to the resistance, to Venezuela. Brazil, I think, will be sort of encouraged to move closer towards Venezuela, something that they failed to do for a host of reasons over the last year. So I'm optimistic. I know that the road ahead will be bloody. The Israeli regime will attack us. Perhaps the Americans will get involved. And the Israelis target civilians, they target innocent people. They slaughter people. We've seen that in Iran already. We see that in Lebanon and in Yemen and in Gaza every day, day and night. But I think ultimately, they're failing. They're and Glenn, one of the things that's I find very stuck is how popular Iran has become. If the Americans and their proxies in the region, which include Qatar and Saudi Arabia and others, with all their wealth, they've been working against Europe decades. And Qatar has, it's not just Al Jazeera, they have a huge, network of religious centers and cultural centers and media, the Saudis and others, the Emirates, and for decades have been demonizing Iran. Disinformation about Iranian, about the Shia, trying to divide Shias and Sunnis, about race, about everything, just trying to create hatred towards Iran. And the Western media, of course, Iran is backward and evil. And it's paradoxical because at the same time, Iran is corrupt, it's evil, people hate it, it's about to implode, they cannot run their own affairs, but it's a growing threat. I don't know how you can be both at the same time. You're a growing threat, but also imploding from within. Which one is it? But since both are negative, all these narratives are negative, even though they're inconsistent, they're believable. Because people say, well, yes, it's nasty, so that must be true. It's negative, so it must be true. But all these are falling apart. At this conference, when I meet people, and in other places, when I speak to colleagues, or when people communicate, or when I see the responses to some of my interviews or interventions, I see the move towards Iran has changed completely. And, people are supportive of Iran, and people are hostile towards Israel. People are supportive of Palestine, and they're hostile towards Zionism. This is I think the biggest shift that we're seeing is the collapse of these narratives. The collapse of these narratives, which have existed really in different forms for hundreds of years. If you look at Western society, and then as their hegemony grew, and then the new technologies became global. They influenced the way in which we thought of ourselves. They influenced the way in which we viewed Russians. They influenced the way in which we viewed the Chinese. They influenced the way the Chinese viewed us. But a lot of those narratives are not collapsing. I can see it, and it's been the last 2 years has been huge in the shift, and especially the last few weeks.